Hi, MS Translators. It is Brett Drummond here again, co-founder and chief science communicator at MS Translate. Been having a really interesting discussion under one of our recent posts on social media about the different forms of MS, neuroinflammation versus neurodegeneration, and when they kick in. So I wanted to record a short video to start to go through some of these concepts with you. So let's get into it. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at two different graphics. This one is a relatively simple graphic. The next one that we're going to look at is slightly more complicated, but we're going to walk through the key components of it. So back when I started in MS research back in 2005, so 21 years ago now, a long time ago, this was a relatively standard graphic that we would see to describe the different forms of multiple sclerosis. So we would discuss three main types of multiple sclerosis. We would have relapsing-remitting MS. And then back at that time, we would say that, around 50% of people living with relapsing-remitting MS would progress to secondary progressive MS within about 10 years of diagnosis. Thankfully, that has definitely changed with the advent of highly effective therapies. And then we had primary progressive MS. So they were the three main types that we talked about. And this sort of explains the differences between the two of them. Sorry, the differences between the three of them. So if we look here on the left-hand side, we have a classic representation of what we think happens during relapsing-remitting MS. So what you'll see is that from the onset of the disease, you have these periods of worsening disability. And so these are what we would call relapses. And you can see that as you go along, a person will have a relapse. There'll be a worsening of symptoms, a worsening of disability. And then for a period of time that differs between individuals, they will then go into a period of remission. And you see that after a relapse, there tends to be recovery that happens, though often the disability never gets back to where it was. So you can see that each period of remission, there is a slightly advanced disability that's occurred. And so you see that we have these relapses and remissions that go on and on throughout the course of that disease. Importantly, we know that that is largely driven by inflammatory processes. And so during relapsing-remitting MS, we would have said that the biggest thing that's happening there that's causing disability progression is neuroinflammation. And that's why all of our therapies that are approved for people living with relapsing-remitting MS target that inflammatory process. So there are anti-inflammatory therapies. They target the immune system to try and dampen that down, suppress the immune system to stop that inflammation from occurring. And then, classically, what we thought happened is that if a person was either diagnosed with primary progressive MS or transitioned into secondary progressive MS, they stopped having these relapses, and instead there was just this constant disability accrual. So you just see this process that the disability would worsen over time. No relapses happening, no attacks, but neither no periods of remission. We knew that also that the rate that this disability accrued was different in different people. So the slope of the curve, for someone might have been quite slow in terms of disability. For others, it could have been quite high. Importantly, the other thought around this was that it was a shift in terms of what was driving the disease. So as to sort of go back over, we said it was inflammation that was driving the disease in that relapsing-remitting phase. In the progressive phase, we had an understanding that it was neurodegeneration that was now the important part to it. And I said this is how we were thinking about things back in 2005, thinking about it before that as well. Before I got involved in MS research, this was the dogma around it. But we now know that this isn't completely accurate. And there's a couple of key things on the next slide that I want to highlight that show some key differences. So, as I said, this slide is complicated and we don't need to go through most of the bits in this. What I want you to focus on is the purple and the blue. and then we're going to touch a little bit on the orange part here. So what you can see, if we sort of try and line it up to about here, this first part here in the purple, this looks quite similar to what we saw before in terms of the relapsing remitting disease. You can see that we have these periods here where there's worsening disability in the attacks. So these are our relapses. This is what's happening here. And then we have these periods of remission that are happening as well. So similar, what we see now is that you can see beyond that point, still just looking at the purple and ignoring the other things, is that while we have a similar gradient line here to what we saw on the previous slide, you can see that there are also attacks that still occur during this. And so we know that some people, even if they're in the progressive form of the disease, can still have inflammation going, and so they can still have these relapses occurring. And this is why we know that some therapies that are used for people with relapsing or remitting MS can still be beneficial in people with progressive MS and secondary progressive MS if they still have that inflammatory component. So if there's still inflammation to treat, if there are still relapses that can be treated, those therapies can still be effective. So that's one change. It's not that you have one and then you have the other. We know that relapses can continue into that second phase of the disease. But importantly now, if we look at the light blue line here, this is what we were referring to before as the neurodegeneration. And so this neurodegeneration that we said kicked in the progressive phase of the disease, we now know actually happens from the very earliest stages of the disease. So these aren't separate like we thought about them back in the day. We thought it was inflammation during relapsing remitting and then neurodegeneration during progressive. What we now know is that you can still have inflammation during progressive, but also that neurodegeneration is happening from the start of disease, even in people with relapsing remitting MS. You do see that there's a change in terms of what's going on. So the neurodegeneration does get more during the progressive phase and the neuroinflammation does get less. So it's almost like a seesaw here where we see, early on it's inflammation that's driving things. And then as you go later, it's neurodegeneration, but they are still both going on. And so this is why you will have heard a concept called PIRA, progression independent of relapse activity. And this is being driven by this neurodegeneration that we know happens at the start. So even if there aren't relapses going on, we know that a person can still progress in their disease. And this is because of this neurodegeneration. And so why is this important? Why are we talking about this? Why have we been having conversations about this on our social media channels? There have been a couple of trials recently where the participant cohort has been people with non-active secondary progressive MS. And so the questions have been, what does this mean? Largely what this means is that we're looking at people with secondary progressive MS, but they don't have that inflammatory component. So they're not experiencing relapses during this time. And so that's what makes them non-active secondary progressive MS. And the important part of that in terms of the success of these therapies is that if a treatment was to be effective in a person with non-active secondary progressive MS, that would indicate that it is targeting and treating that neurodegenerative component of the disease. And this is important because we don't really have any therapies yet that can do that. And so that's why we're interested in that. But it's also why it's really important that we understand all of the different disease aspects that are going on and what's driving progression at different stages. So hopefully that explanation helps. If you do have any questions, please do drop them below the video and I'll be happy to try and answer them. Thanks, everyone.